This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Guy Dampier, senior researcher on Nationhood at the Prosperity Institute, on the scourge of illegal immigration and what can be done about it.
We should be paying attention to Trump because he's already shown that if we gain control of the border, we can do that. Many of our laws are creating log jams, basically, creating issues that cannot be resolved. And so either we're going to have these issues mounting up and mounting up and mounting up until they eventually just overwhelm the system entirely, or you're going to have to change the law.
The Motability Scheme. Simple, affordable, reliable.
William Yarwood, media campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, on how, post-COVID, abuse of the Motability car scheme for disabled people is taking taxpayers for a ride.
The eligibility for PIP has become a lot easier if you have mental health problems. There's now over 800,000 people on the Motability scheme, and that's been an increase of 170,000 than the year before. It's costing taxpayers billions of pounds.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to David Shipley, a writer on prisons and justice, on the sinister politics behind the new Netflix series Adolescence, and the twee tyranny of Paddington Bear.
The idea that to be a true Briton, you have to love Paddington Bear is obscene. Why are we valorising this character who broke the law, came here clearly without a visa? Under our law, Paddington Bear should be deported.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Immigration is one of the great issues of our times. It has profound impacts on our culture, our economy, and our way of life. And since the Boris wave of major post-COVID immigration, these have become more obvious than ever. But with public attention now firmly fixed on this issue, the question is, what can be done about it? And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Guy Dampier, who's a senior researcher on Nationhood at the Prosperity Institute and a writer for publications including The Telegraph. Welcome to The Sceptic, Guy.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so there's been this week of broadside essays on immigration in The Telegraph, and you've written one of them, and that's on the topic of illegal migration, actually, which we haven't covered so much here at the Daily Sceptic yet. And so I suppose to start with, tell us a bit about, well, the scale of that problem. I mean, how many illegal migrants are there in Britain? I suppose one of the issues with that is that, well, we don't necessarily know, do we?
Exactly that. That is the biggest problem. So we really have two major sources of illegal immigrants. We've got people who are coming across the Channel. We do have good statistics on how many of them there are because they're handing themselves into the authorities and then going through the asylum system. What we don't have is we don't have good information on people who come here usually legally and then choose to overstay or to break their visa in some other way and just remain here. And a large part of the problem there is that under the Blair government, they abolished exit checks. So it used to be that, what you presume, you come to the airport, we check your passports there, you leave the country, we check your passport and say, this person came in, this person left. We didn't do that for years and years and years and years. And as a result, we don't have a very good idea of how many people left the country. We know roughly how many people came in, but we don't know how many left the country. So there's a large clandestine population. We've had various attempts to quantify it over the years. There've been various different studies. I think the most recent one you can find the Migration Observatory has a very good briefing where they put them all together. The most recent one was in 2019, and I think their high estimate was 1.2 million. So 1.2 million people in 2019. The Home Office usually assumes it's about 50,000 a year. Probably has gone up with the sort of increased immigration of the last few years. But basically, at 50,000 a year from 2019 to now, you're looking at about 1.5 million people, possibly more. Migration Watch has said that they think it could be as high as 2 million. And that's not completely unbelievable because, again, there are other sources that suggest it. So there are an unusually large number of active SIM cards. We produce more sewage than the official population we have. We use more electricity than the official population we have. We eat more food in the supermarkets than we officially have the population for. So all of these things suggest that there is a large clandestine population, but we just don't have a good handle on it. And from what I understand, the Home Office be very wary about actually trying to estimate it properly, in no small part because they're aware that if they do, somebody will ask them, well, what are you going to do about it? And that's where things get difficult.
And of course, one of the most visible aspects of this and things that people associate with it is the small boats crossings. Now, that is one part of it, but it's not the only part. And in fact, there are effects of this in wider society as well that people will have noticed, though they might not necessarily have linked them directly to illegal migration. I mean, tell us a bit about that.
Well, if you remember the Grenfell Tower disaster, one of the things that happened after that was they had to have a basic amnesty for illegal immigrants who've been in the tower. As you're walking the streets, especially if you're walking the streets in London, you will be walking past illegal people every day, and you probably won't know it. Some of them, you may not just notice the difference compared to a homeless person or someone else. Some people, they may be working illegally within the economy. They look like a normal worker. Years ago, when I did some volunteering with the homeless charity, we had people who were working completely illegally on construction sites, and it was well known that they would go stand on a particular street corner, the van would turn up, it would take them to the construction site, they would work there. And usually be through a subcontractor, so the actual person doing the building didn't know. But that's absolutely and perennial across Britain. Like that will be in every single major city you go to, and lots of towns as well. You're going to find illegal workers either living or working there.
And of course, there's the black economy, and then there's also some businesses that seem to be relying on this type of labour, and Deliveroo, I think, perhaps is one of them. I mean, tell us about some of the shenanigans that have been going on there.
So Deliveroo is slightly different in that we usually involve people who are here legally, but are illegally working. So a lot of them are students or something similar, and they shouldn't be doing this kind of work, but they are just doing it on site anyway, not declaring tax or anything else. And that's enabled because Deliveroo and some of the other companies allow for something called substitution. So you can substitute another driver for the person that actually owns the account. And what this has meant is that people can very easily earn small sums of money, but if they've got low living costs or whatever else, it's good money for them, especially if they come from a less developed country. There has been a slight crackdown, but I think it was something like 100, 150 accounts were terminated. And it's pretty obvious when you speak to people that the problem is significantly larger than that. So again, I think there's been an issue where the authorities have not bothered to check this stuff. It's been sort of low-hanging fruit. They've got a lot of other crimes to deal with, and they've just basically ignored the issue. But it does mean that we had large amounts of illegal labour, sometimes from illegal immigrants, operating within our economy.
And you mentioned that reticence there even to count the problem, let alone to do anything about it. And of course, one of the ways this debate has become a bit toxic in a way is this question of the phrase mass deportations. And you have people saying that that's shouldn't be said, even including Nigel Farage, in fact. And yet that always strikes me as strange, really, because you could rephrase this as simply enforcing our own laws and our own borders, because if people come here illegally, then they should be deported, shouldn't they?
Absolutely. Well, I think one problem with the phrase is that a lot of people associate it with mass deportations of immigrants, regardless of legal status. But that's partly because no one's defined the phrase particularly. In reality, what we're talking about is talking about illegal immigrants. And I think that's the sense in which Trump has used it. That's the sense in which I used it. And as you say, this is a rule of law issue. We are talking, even if you take the lowest estimates, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who have broken the law, who are working often illegally in the economy, some of whom pose a threat. And to take their perspective, people who are extremely vulnerable to exploitation, who are often living in terrible conditions, who are often working in bad conditions, who are open to exploitation by various unpleasant gangs. And you see this particularly with certain communities, like I said, the Vietnamese, where there's a lot of illegal prostitution. So when people get very upset about it, you've got to ask, well, what is your alternative? Your alternative to enforcing the law is either regularizing law, which means you're going to add hundreds of thousands of people to the population with no democratic mandate, and you're going to report them for breaking the law, and you're going to encourage more people to break the law in future, and then they will suffer exploitation and other dangers. Or you've got the status quo, and the status quo is to say that at a minimum, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who are going to live in shabby conditions, often working in sort of borderline slave conditions themselves, some of whom are open to incredible levels of exploitation. I'd rather not. I'd rather not have that. I think actually the moral thing to do is to be clear that we have borders, they will be enforced, and people that commit crimes will be dealt with.
And so there's two questions. There's whether it's politically feasible to campaign on this issue, and then there's whether it's institutionally feasible and, possible to get the state to actually get its act together and do this. And I think the example of Donald Trump that you point to in your article really shows that, well, in fact, both of those are possible. I mean, that's something that we should be taking heed of, isn't it?
Definitely. Well, we should be paying attention to Trump, partly because he's a successful politician, partly because he's already shown that they can get control of the border again, which they have done within a couple of months. They've regained control of the border. And going back to my last thing, that's massively reduced the levels of exploitation. So that's an unequivocally good thing. We can do that. We probably couldn't do it under the current laws, but then I think we can see across a range of different issues that many of our laws are creating log jams, basically, creating issues that cannot be resolved. And so either we're going to have these issues mounting up and mounting up and mounting up until they eventually just overwhelm the system entirely, or you're going to have to change the law. And a lot of the people who are critical of mass deportations or critical of this idea of enforcing the law against illegal immigrants basically want to try and maintain the old system that came in under Blair. They want to try and they're quite reactionary in that sense. And they're trying to uphold these laws that actually aren't working any longer, that in many cases are broken or are breaking the system. And that's clearly not tenable.
And so in terms of changing that then, obviously the responsibility here is with the state. And so, I mean, how should the state go about this? But I know you've also been suggesting that the market might in some way take responsibility for it as well.
Definitely. So there is an issue in that we're talking about a very large clandestine population. It would be an enormous effort to deal with, just to move these people from one country to another. So I wrote in the article I did for Telegraph that you could, in principle, remove the up to 2 million people within 3 days of Heathrow. Now, obviously, that's in principle. You're not actually going to do that. It's very unlikely you'd manage to find 2 million people, bring them all to the airport, and remove them over 3 days, barring everything else. But if you break that down across a year, you could remove that number of people with only 5,000 a day, which, if you're got big airplanes, is about 20 planes a day. That's a completely manageable level. And in reality, again, this is probably going to carry out over several years. So we're talking about relatively small amounts of people, but just continuously being removed. That's completely feasible. Heathrow handles, I think, 84 million passengers a year. The idea that you can't deal with it's not just one airport. The idea you can't deal with this is ludicrous. And I said elsewhere, it's ludicrous in the world after COVID. We locked everybody into their houses multiple years. We put the entire economy onto life support. We punished people and set the police everywhere. We arrested people for being in the park. We arrested people for going for a walk. And then we developed novel vaccines. And then we had a massive vaccination drive and gave it to everybody. And we did all that in the space of a couple of years. So the idea that there isn't the ability to do this is completely wrong in my view. The state can do this. As it currently stands, I think there will be huge issues. Some of those are legal issues. I think there's a broader case there for leaving the ECHR, for repealing the Human Rights Act, dealing with some of these human rights issues that have made the asylum system into a huge Trojan horse and are costing everyone a fortune and are clearly just rewarding people who have the money and willingness to risk their lives and empower criminals to come here, but don't really have what most people would consider an asylum play. In most cases, it's an economic thing. They may well be in danger if they went home, in the sense that it's a more dangerous place. But actually, it's not like they're in personal danger the whole time. And we have regular stories from the tribunals showing ludicrous decisions. So the laws will have to change. And then there's immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement has always been the sort of to use a probably politically correct phrase these days, but it's always been the redhead stepchild of the Home Office. It's been the thing that gets the least money, gets the least love, the least attention compared to the police or counterterrorism or whatever else. And that's unfair. That shouldn't be the case. So I think we can provide more support. I think that support would actually be beneficial, both in the sense that you'd get more good decisions because you would have fewer issues where the money runs out, forcing them to make bad decisions. And also because you'd be able to look after the people that you're putting through the system. We don't actually want a rough system. We are not talking about throwing people in the bat. We are talking about doing things in a responsible, legal, orderly fashion. So actually you need to invest for the welfare of the people who will be going through the system as well. And then finally, I did suggest using the private sector, using the market. And my suggestion was that you could take bailiffs or civilian enforcement officers, which already exist on the statute books, they already exist in law. They've got certain powers, like the power to detain and the power to arrest, and they have particular rules that they have to follow, which are set by the courts themselves. And you could use these to essentially say that they would collect the fines from the people who are benefiting from illegal immigration, whether that is by renting to them or whether that's by employing them illegally. And you would increase the size of the fine. Currently is something like £30,000. I suggest £100,000, but it needs to be enough to make it worthwhile. And you would enable these firms to identify, bring the illegal immigrants to court, and then once they are removed, they would be paid out with the full value of the fine. And that would make it extremely worth their while to do this sort of thing. It would enable them to scale it up quite quickly and scale it down quite quickly. And it would minimize the need for tons of bureaucracy. And also because the government would be able to set the rules under which they operate, you would be able to minimize the levels of incompetence that would go on, or the levels of potential law breaking. Because obviously with all legal enforcement, there is a danger that some people are going to break the rules or break the laws. But if the government is able to set it, and if there's strong financial penalties, you can create a culture which will ensure that this is done in the proper, appropriate, competent, robust manner.
Okay, and so there's the state's responsibility, there's getting the market to take care of some of it, and then, of course, the final thing is actually getting the deportees to do it themselves. Tell us a bit about that.
So one suggestion I make, and this is based, I should say, on an idea originally by the Center for Immigration Studies in the United States, is that you could also let the illegal immigrants collect the value if they self-deport. So you could let them essentially collect the fine from their own employer or from their own landlord by handing themselves in and providing evidence, and then agreeing to return home. And for a lot of them, we already pay a voluntary fee for people to remove themselves. This would simply be part of that. It would be a larger fee, and for a lot of people, it would probably feel worthwhile, especially for those who are trapped in that sort of shadow world where they're making money, but they're not making enough money and they're suffering exploitation. But, the difficulties of going home. This would be you're returning home and you've got a chunk of cash. You can set yourself up and well, you can spend it on wine and women if you want to, but you can also try to start a business or whatever else. And for Britain, it would still be a good financial decision because expensive as this might be, and it would be expensive, the net fiscal costs of these people becoming legal immigrants, of us regularizing them, will be substantially higher. And the cost to the country of the rule of law being damaged and of workers being undercut and of the other dangers that we face are much higher. So it would be an expensive policy, but actually it would then be lowering costs in other areas.
Although, does this not raise the possibility of abuse of this system? I mean, what if they come back in and take the money again?
Well, it would only be abused if they did that twice. I think you could very easily put in a rule. You'd have the CBP-1 app, which is what the Americans rolled out under Biden, which enabled asylum seekers to claim asylum. Under Trump, they turned that into a different app, a self-deportation app, where if you remove yourself from the country and you provide photographic or other evidence that you've left the country and are no longer illegally within the United States, then you have the opportunity to return to the United States as a legal immigrant if you pass the tests and get the visa and everything else. If you're deported, you will never return. You are permanently barred. And I think that's exactly what you do with this. If you accept removing yourself from the country, fine. But if you come back illegally ever again, then we will simply put you in jail and you will go to jail for a long time.
Okay, and so that's illegal immigration. That's obviously a very important topic. But of course, immigration as a whole is a bigger issue. And really the bigger changes people will have noticed actually are from legal immigration that has taken place over many years, but it's really accelerated in the past 3 or 4 years. And so your article is part of this series in the Telegraph, documenting how enormous some of these changes have been. And what were some of the key points you think that were raised there? But I suppose one that really stands out to me is that, these major changes to our society that we've seen, no one ever really voted for them to happen, did they? And that's something that can't be said enough.
Yes, I think it's a point well worth making. Every single manifesto, I think, since 1997 of a party that's won election has promised to reduce or control immigration. And yet, ever since 1997, immigration has never been below 100,000 a year. And in fact, as we know, in recent years has increased massively. I think a lot of people confuse illegal and legal. They're upset at the pace of change, but they don't necessarily know where it comes from. So the legal issue is a massive one. It's also the easier one to control. We have the tools already within the immigration rules. The government now, or any government in the future, could very simply use the immigration rules, change the criteria by which people come into the country, and you could raise the standards, not even to an absurdly high level. I mean, if you raise the standards and said, you need to be a net fiscal contributor to the British economy, you need to be something like £38,000 a year. But of course, as a migrant, you're also placing more stress on infrastructure like schools, roads, hospitals, whatever else. So let's assume that that's a bit extra. Let's just say £50,000. If you just use the immigration rules and raise the salary cap to get into the country of any visa to £50,000, you would overnight reduce immigration by an enormous amount. And you'd also have the beneficial effect of making sure that most migration is more likely to come from culturally compatible areas. So that's a relatively easy to move to do, and it can and should be done. There's also an issue of what we do with the legal immigration we already have. And one of the articles in that series we find is Sam Bidwell of the ASI, who pointed out that with the large numbers of people that we had coming in 2022, 2023, and 2024, we are looking at something like, I think there's figures from Centre for Policy Studies from Carl Williams there, and again, done great work. I think it's something like 800,000 migrants over the course of this Parliament could receive indefinite leave to remain after only 5 years. And that will result in a lifetime cost of £234 billion. So we're talking, Rachel Reeves is talking about a £22 billion black hole. She is sitting on a £234 billion black hole that is ready to come unless they change the rules on indefinite leave to remain. So they should absolutely change the rules on that immediately. They should absolutely use the immigration rules to restrict the amount of people coming in. And I think they'll find that a lot of the integration issues become significantly less problematic when you simply don't have, the number of people coming every year around the same size as the city of Birmingham. When you've got a small number of people, there's a country to integrate into. When you have large numbers of people will end up forming their own communities, and not through their own fault, not through any evil intentions, but they will cluster and they will form separate communities, and those separate communities will have separate cultures of their own, which will cause problems. So we need to massively reduce immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, and we need to make sure that people who are in the country that can be allowed to go home should be allowed to go home. We should not try and make every single person that comes to this country a citizen, because it's just not going to work. The scale is just too high already, let alone in the future.
And so on that issue of ILR, this is a point that Sam Bidwell has been making a lot. He's told this podcast in December about this. I know you were writing in the Telegraph about this. I, in fact, wrote something in the Spectator as well. And here we are a few months later, and the Conservatives have actually basically taken up this policy in its entirety. Is there something quite encouraging in that these radical seeming but necessary steps are now being listened to by our mainstream political parties? And the people are taking this more seriously now, aren't they?
I think they are. Again, the scale of the problems is now so large that in many ways it's very hard to avoid this. You have to be willfully blind to ignore this stuff. And I think you could even to a small degree see that with the Labour government. We had the announcement just this weekend that they're looking to return the hubs in the Balkans. Now, that's different to the Rwanda plan, and I have strong suspicion that it won't work. Certainly the Italian attempt to do similarly has not worked. But you can see that they are searching around for alternatives because they are aware that this is actually causing major issues and they don't have solutions. I think that there is still a lack of ambition in the way that people are looking at it. There's still far too many people who think you can just change a few little bits and bobs and it'll be fine, when actually the scale of immigration in the last 2 years, and certainly over the last 20 years, has been so high that actually we need to be looking at a very, very serious pause. And I've cited before, in the 1920s, the Americans brought in immigration restrictions rules. We wouldn't do the exact same rules that they did because they were very specific to that time. But one of the side effects of them massively reducing immigration was that it gave people time to integrate. And combined with the Second World War, it meant that America went from having a very, very large foreign population to a population of people who did get along, who had been broken up, who couldn't simply marry people from the old country, who couldn't simply travel back and keep up the old ways. And there were still problems. We probably all watch films like The Godfather, and we don't think of that as an immigration problem. But The Godfather is an immigration problem. It's about a clan of foreign immigrants who moved over, brought their old ways with them, are causing problems within the host culture, and are being deeply insular and having strong cultural difficulties integrating with the WASP culture as it then was. So there will still be issues. There's bound to be issues as a result of what's happened over the last 20, 30 years. But if we could bring in a pause on immigration, we will find integration much, much easier.
And so to come back to the changes we've seen and the ways we've had to adapt to our demographically changed society, one of the things that's really been in the news in the past year is this idea of two-tier justice that we've been seeing again and again and again. And it does seem that the way that we're adapting to multiculturalism essentially is to create a system which formally or informally ends up discriminating against the white majority in order to sort of equalize outcomes or anything else, or to appease, activist minority groups. And I think that's going to, as far as people continue to connect that with mass immigration with the demographic change, that's going to create this roiling anger, it seems to me, which is going to, keep this issue very much on the map.
I think that's true. I mean, you can see how in the aftermath of the Southport riots and the general riots across the country, how strong the feeling about two-tier justice was. And I think it's a reasonable fear. The rioters, in many cases, do seem to be they committed crimes, and we should be clear that having committed crimes, they should have faced the law. But they seem to be facing the law in a rather tougher way than anybody else. And it was very clear in Birmingham, for instance, where there were ethnic minority, Muslim rioters coming out on the street and attacking people, that they didn't face the same crackdown and they didn't face the same severity. You didn't get Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper talking about it in quite the same way as they were talking about the white rioters. So it does seem to me that there is an issue. There's an issue that you get, I think, in all societies with large minority populations, which is that people will inevitably feel certain stronger cultural ties, people will have certain political ties, and then people will look at the group competition and they will judge, this group is being treated unfairly, or my group is being treated unfairly, this other group is getting privileges. And you see that, to be honest, all the time in left-wing rhetoric. That's broadly what the idea of racial disparities is, that black people get treated worse than white people do by the police or whatever else. What's surprising for them is now getting this in reverse. And you can see from completely the sympathy that they have towards this, that actually they're not really concerned with justice. That unfortunately, again, it quite often is about supporting the particular group you support. So I think, unfortunately, yes, mass immigration has produced a system where you have got group competitions, not with everybody, but you do have group competitions. And that's going to produce greater and greater frictions. And I thought it was very interesting to see David Betts of King's College London talking about the potential for future civil war recently in some articles and also I think on some podcasts. Because there's an element of truth to that. We're not in that situation yet. But when you look at countries like Lebanon, which did have a massive wave of Palestinian immigration, that did have a long-term effect. The core population of Lebanon was degraded. It did lose power. It did lose control. There was an attempt to take over these areas. And it did lead in the end to a civil war, to an Israeli invasion, and to all kinds of very unpleasant things happening. And you can see that in lots of other areas. It's very, very difficult to maintain a multicultural, multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity. And in order to do it, you have to have very fair rules for everybody. And you realistically do probably need to have a core population who will provide the sort of integratable hub for everybody else. We've got a problem insofar as the number of people coming in is too high and it's eroding that. So there are lots of places in the country where you go where not a lot of people speak English as their first language, or where there just is no population to integrate into anymore. And we're also facing a problem of group competition, which is made significantly worse by some of these multicultural policies that have been adapted, which have effectively ended up being about raising the power of non-white or non-Christian minorities at the expense of the core population. And that has caused, understandably, a large degree of friction, even if obviously prejudice goes both ways. And I think we do need to be very, very clear that if we want to have a country that works, it has to be the same rules for everybody.
So that's an interesting question of how do you get to the same rules being applied for everybody? And of course, last time we spoke about the rape gangs, and one of the things about that phenomenon that was quite an outrage was that the anti-white element of these crimes, which was really obvious, was basically completely ignored by the justice system. And, when it comes to hate crimes, there are these bodies called hate crime scrutiny panels. And when you look at them, you look at the composition of them, they have representatives from various victim groups, like Muslim groups, like Jewish groups, like black groups, and others. But you find that they don't have representatives for white people or for Christians in the main. And so, that's a two-tier system, one might say, and partly explains why anti-white hate crime is basically ignored. But this can also, from a policy standpoint, getting to more colourblind justice can point in two different directions. On the one hand, you might say, well, let's get rid of the whole edifice of community policing and just restore a totally neutral application of the rule of law. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, no, we need there to be an equivalent white community group or a Christian community group to be inserted into this multicultural paradigm. So, between those, where do you land?
I tend to be suspicious of creating more identity groups. I think that would just create more issues. And I think if you do create groups specifically for whites, what you'll have is it will actually become quite divisive. It'll become a sort of a sop to these kind of things. It's never going to have the same bite or the same power as the other groups. You're never going to see a world where a figure, a controversial figure like Tommy Robinson is leading a white community group. And this is not an endorsement of Tommy Robinson, but he's not more controversial than some of the people who've led various ethnic minority identity groups and who've never faced sort of similar levels of scrutiny. Obviously, I think the level of scrutiny should be the same for all of them. So I tend to be against that. I think what you've got to have is you've got to have the same rule for everybody. But there is a difficulty, as you say, which is that if we're talking about people integrating, we're talking about setting those ground rules. Who is setting those ground rules? And I think that is the situation where you have to say that there is a population before mass immigration that inhabited the British Isles, that there may be elements of diversity in the sense that we all have sort of, if I've done a DNA test myself, I can tell that I've got DNA from various different countries, but broadly they're all within a similar area. And most of them are British in one form or another. There's a bit of Irish, there's a bit of Welsh, there's a bit of English. There is a core population. That is the core population of the country. In this country, it happens to be white. In other countries, it would happen to be another ethnicity. But that is the core population, and their culture has to be the core culture of the place. And we should probably think of it more as somewhere like Israel. Israel is a Jewish state. It's a state for the Jewish people. Well, Britain is a state for the British people. That doesn't make it exclusive of other people based on religion or ethnicity or whatever else, but it does mean that those core norms should be set by the historical continuity of what the British nation is. And I think actually that's something that large numbers of immigrants themselves want. And I've had that conversation with people as well, where they've said one of the things that they don't like is that with immigration changing the face of the country, it is changing those core norms. And the very norms that attracted them to Britain, the norms that they enjoyed when they came here, are under threat. And they actually find that a big problem. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to say, there is a core group to Britain. They are the people who have set the cultural norms. It's not set in aspect. That's not forever. They've changed over time. But we need to have that core population. We need to have those core cultural norms. And we will be prioritizing those, but everybody will be treated fairly.
I mean, so that's a really key point to remember, isn't it? That there's a core population and you can recognize that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to expel everyone who is not of that particular core population, right? It's not one or the other here. But nevertheless, if you continue to erode and denigrate the majority culture and sense of identity, then, well, that's going to lead to a backlash and it's going to be unstable.
Yeah, it's going to be unstable and you're going to have issues. So, I mean, if we were to go back to the Grinningham issues, for example, one of the key elements of integration generally over time is intermarriage. Do you marry people from the core population? So my wife is an immigrant. She's married me. I think that although she is a British citizen, I don't think she would say she is as British culturally as me, because she wouldn't be. She hasn't grown up here. She hasn't had the same exposure. Our children can be British, or they could be from her nationality. That's a choice that they will have the option to make. But they have that integratable choice in two locations. On the other hand, if you're someone who comes from a foreign background and only marries people from your own home country, the effect will be to recreate the culture of your home country. So I think that's one of the key features we've got to have. Not so many people actually intermarrying, integrating, joining with the general culture, no matter where they come from.
Yes, indeed. Well, that all sounds very sensible. Guy Dampier, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Now, when was the last time you bought a new car? Times are tight, and many motorists today are buying second-hand. So it's pretty galling to learn that the government's Motability scheme, which is designed to help provide cars for disabled people, is being exploited by many who aren't disabled at all, in order to get their hands on its brand new, high-end vehicles. Are hard-working taxpayers being taken for a ride? Well, to discuss this, I'm very pleased to be joined by William Yarwood, who is the Media Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to The Sceptic, William.
Hi, Laurie. Thanks for having me on the show, man.
Yeah, good to have you on. So, William, just to kick us off here, I mean, what is Motability and the personal independence payment?
Yeah, sure. So PIP's been around for a little while now and is paid to about 3.6 million people across the UK who have long-term physical or mental health conditions. And there's a standard rate and there's an enhanced rate. But the enhanced rate is what we really need to be looking at if we're going to be talking about the Motability scheme, because the standard rate doesn't entitle you to Motability. So let's take the standard rate out of our minds just for the moment. And also within this, there's a daily living component and a Motability component. And claimants may be eligible for one or both of these components, and you also can get it if you're working, and you also can get it if you're not working. So there's a level of flexibility around this. So from 2026, November 2026, due to Kendall's new reforms, which she brought in just last week, although I'm sure we'll see more reforms to come as the spring budget comes up and as Reeves and Kendall sort of figure out how to reduce Britain's welfare bill. The government's saying that people need to score at least 4 points for one activity instead of qualifying for support with a score that could describe less severe difficulty. So that's across a broad range of tasks, from needing help to wash your hair or your body below the waist. So that would be 2 points. But for example, needing to help wash between your shoulders and waist would equate to 4 points. So it can get a little complicated with the sort of point system and so on and so forth. But generally, you need a certain level of points to qualify for the standard PIP and then enhanced PIP. So the payments, recent statistics show that a standard rate of £72.64 per week is for the daily living. An enhanced rate of 108.55 is also per week. Then the payments for the Motability element, you can get a standard rate for £28.70 per week and an enhanced rate of £70.75 per week. And PIP's usually paid over 4 weeks and is completely tax-free. And as I said earlier, this enhanced rate of PIP enables you to go onto what's called the Motability scheme. Now, the Motability scheme was set up in actually 1977 by Jim Callaghan. So that's the last Labour government before Thatcher came in. It was designed to replace the sort of rickety, single-seater, three-wheeled, what were called Invacars, which were donated to disabled people after the war. And his government also introduced what we now know is the Motability allowance to help disabled people choose a sort of suitable vehicle, including any necessary adaptations under the car leasing scheme. So, if you had something, if you had an issue with your arms or with your legs, or you needed to sit in a certain way, the car could be adapted to meet those needs. And for 50 years, it was a pretty successful and relatively uncontroversial scheme that the majority of people supported. It helps people with cerebral palsy, people with Parkinson's, people with severe mobility issues who, without this car, could actually not achieve independence and happiness in their daily lives, and actually enables people to get into work and not have to use public transport and so on and so forth. And in exchange for the Motability component of your benefit that you get from the enhanced rate of PIP, you could get a car for this sake. And the thing about the Motability scheme, like I said, Laurie, is that it was remarkably uncontroversial and remarkably not looked at, because everyone sort of just accepted that this was a good thing to do. And I still, to some extent, do think it is a good thing that we have this scheme in place. But my concern now, and it's not just my concern, it's various other people's concerns, is that the eligibility for PIP has become a lot easier if you have mental health problems. And this has enabled people to get onto the Motability scheme a lot easier. And this scheme has ballooned to such a large extent that it's costing taxpayers billions of pounds. And if Liz Kendall and the Labour government want to do anything about welfare reform, they need to be thinking about the Motability scheme, which actually, interestingly, apparently is, according to Bloomberg, on ministers' lips at the moment, because they are looking at this and considering this as a potential way in which to crack down on fraud inside of the benefit system and reduce the bill overall for taxpayers, and also make sure that this scheme works for people who genuinely need it.
Yes, and I think that's a key point. I mean, people will really not be upset about the idea of someone with Parkinson's, say, having access to this type of thing. But there's this change between, severe disabilities and more mental health things. And, well, tell us a bit more about that. When in particular do you think this started to happen?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just crunch some data for you quickly, if you don't mind, Laurie, specifically about the ADHD and autism and mental health stuff. So let's just quickly talk about the increase in Motability clients over the last year. So this is from 2023 to 24. There's now over 800,000 people on the Motability scheme, and that's been an increase of 170,000 than the year before. And the eligible population for the Motability scheme has dramatically increased since 2019. It's increased by about 500,000, which is, as you can agree, a significant number of more people than previously. We at the TPA crunched some stats from the DWP regarding enhanced rate PIP claimants and standard rate PIP claimants since about 2016. And we found that enhanced rate PIP claimants since 2016 is up by 439%. While the standard rate PIP claimants is up 270%. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the enhanced rate of PIP is what enables you to get onto this Motability scheme. So that 439% increase is showing that there's now more people than ever before eligible for the Motability scheme. And also, a lot of this enhanced rate PIP increase is due to the fact that a lot of enhanced rate PIP claimants are now claiming for things like mental health, ADHD, autism, and so on and so forth. So we crunched some numbers on that. So in 2016, so for ADHD-based Motability eligibility, it was only about 2,300 people in 2016, which is not really that many people at all. It's now over 35,000 people. That's an increase of about 1,400%. That's a huge increase. What's it called? We've also found that just under 50% of all PIP cases are due to mental health. The first one is to do with mixed anxiety and depression, so that's about a third. And about 2/3 are related to autism. But if we add it into, again, taking away the numbers and talking about the people, that's 650,000 more people, right? So there's been an explosion in the enhanced rate of PIP over the last few years. Now, I will admit that there is a, there's multifaceted and complex reasons for this, which I'll quickly go into. I think, first of all, and this is something the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, now Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride himself admits, is that there's been a sort of over-broadening of the eligibility and over-diagnosis of mental health conditions, especially since COVID. So there's been a sharp rise in claims of mental health conditions, like I mentioned, to do with ADHD, autism, and anxiety. And both Mel Stride and actually a clinical psychologist who talked to Fraser Nelson on his fantastic documentary about the Britain's ballooning benefit bill, she warned that basically what we've had since COVID-19 is a medicalization, if you will, of the ups and downs in life. So everybody gets anxious at some point, everyone gets low. Everyone has points in their life where they'd, rather not get out of bed or rather not do work and so on and so forth. But since COVID, we've had this weird increase where people are actually medicalizing these norms, and now they're able to get on the enhanced rate of PIP and also, therefore, in that case, the Motability scheme. So there's also been a dramatic rise amongst young people mental health as well. Mental health amongst 18 to 25-year-olds skyrocketed since COVID-19. As you can probably notice, I'm leading up to a bigger point about COVID-19, as you can probably tell. And also that means that a lot of those people are now just being written off completely and saying, no, you've got a mental illness. You need to, stay off work. You need to not go into work for a variety of reasons. And that's just killing ambition, and that's killing economic growth, and that's taking some of the best years of a young person's life. I'm 25. That's taking some of the best years of your life away from you, and some of the first years where you can really, get your career started and really get to work. Obviously, I mentioned COVID a lot in that, and as you can probably tell, I think COVID is a big blame for this. So, but that's not an original opinion from me. That's actually from Sam Ashworth-Hayes in The Telegraph, who wrote a fantastic article about this. And he pointed out basically that the pandemic sort of normalized engagement with the welfare state, if that makes sense. So lots of people before March 2020 had never seen a benefit form, have never gone through a single process. They'd never even talked to the DWP for crying out loud. And basically, COVID changed how the average Brit saw the state. Once you were getting furlough, once you were getting grants and so on and so forth, they suddenly became aware of what was open to them, really. And they learned how to navigate the system. They learned what was on offer. And in short, as Hayes puts it in his article, the exposure to the welfare state has the effect of increasing future use. So if you know what's there, you're more likely to use it in the future. And also, once you get using the welfare state, you feel like you're almost, it is an entitlement to that point. It's like, well, if I'm not using it and everyone else is, well, I'm sort of being taken as a bit of a mug, really. I need to be using this as well. And, you combine that with a collapse in trust in society, which happened not just with COVID, but for a variety of reasons. In a high trust society, people are less likely to want to go into the welfare state if they don't need it, or even if they do need it. Some people will find other ways because they might consider themselves, I don't need to do that. I don't want to waste taxpayers' cash, so on and so forth. And also another element of COVID, which has sort of changed the way our welfare state works, is there's been a complete collapse in face-to-face PIP assessments. So before COVID, around 80% of PIP assessments were done face to face, which that sounds pretty normal. That makes complete sense. The 20% people who can't leave their homes or are disabled for some reason, in some way, which doesn't allow them to travel around or get on public transport or wherever that might be. Now, only 2% of PIP assessments are done face to face. Right, that is a dramatic change just over the last few years, to the extent that PIP assessors are now just doing it over Zoom and over webcam, just like we're talking now. So they're doing things over webcam does have a change. You can't sort of read body language as well. You can't the sort of not the personality. I'll repeat that. The personal element of it has been completely taken away, to the extent that people will, can look in a certain way or say certain things, and also there's also no real incentive to really dig through what this person is genuinely saying. Are they genuinely disabled? Are they disabled wanting to get back to work? Are they taking the mickey and a variety of other things? You can't often tell that stuff through a webcam. And again, that's the fault of COVID, and the DWP and the state has not decided to sort of take that back up since COVID. Like, they haven't decided to take up back many things.
Is that just because there's so many more? Why do you think that is, that they haven't gone back to face to face?
So I think that there's an element of the cost of it, and there's also an element of the I think basic state failure. I think there's an element that post-COVID, I think people feel like there's nothing in society that really works anymore, and this is one element. This is just one tiny element of that, of things not going back to the way that they used to feel and happen. Obviously I'm not against people having PIP assessments over the phone or over webcam, but I do think that like 98% of them happening over webcam is quite insane, and also could potentially lead to, and has potentially led to, fraud in the system, to the extent where people, are receiving money that they otherwise shouldn't be receiving, and more importantly, taking money away from people who genuinely do need it. And I think that the third element I'd like to mention here also is the rise of what's called sickfluencers. So I'm sure people are sort of very well aware of sickfluencers now. But sickfluencers have sort of had quite a big efflorescence over the last few years on not just like your traditional platforms like Facebook and internet forums, but on places like TikTok, which are showing people how to get around the welfare system in order to claim the maximum for their PIP or their or other benefits and disability benefits they might be able to get. And a lot of these, TikTok sickfluencers, obviously not exclusively on TikTok, but a lot of them are essentially helping people say, here's the trigger words you need to say. If you say you're suicidal, for example, the DWP assessor will just immediately put you onto the higher rate. That's also not my words. That's also from a former DWP assessor who talked to Fraser Nelson on his Dispatches documentary about this issue. So that's not my word. That's the DWP assessor saying that. And also when it comes to the rise in sickfluencers, they've got tens of thousands of followers, millions of views. To the extent that actually probably more people have seen those videos and more people have seen those content creators than they have actually read like DWP official advice on the website. People can say, all they like about, it's hard to get, certain benefits and it's hard to do X, Y, and Z, but it's also objectively wrong that people who either don't need as much as they're getting or don't need it at all are able to go on TikTok and Facebook and claim for things, which then takes money away from the people who genuinely need it, who perhaps have no idea about these sickfluencers and are perhaps doing it the honourable, normal way that they've done it in the past. So sickfluencers are a cool part of it. There was the famous one recently regarding Motability of a guy in a red balaclava on TikTok, essentially telling, almost with glee, saying that, oh, how fantastic it is that the British state is able to give you a quote unquote free car, which we can come on to a little bit on to the extent that it is free. But the fact that he was promoting this on his TikTok, and then people who will argue against my positions or positions of people who think like me will say, well, Motability isn't free, disability benefits are hard to claim, and so on and so forth. My point would be, why are all these sick influencers, including that guy, pointing out how easy, in inverted commas, it is to get if there's nothing wrong with the system? Like, I think there's clear problems with the system and it needs reform, but of course that's very difficult, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know exactly how to solve any of that. But more broadly, there's sort of the three main things. It's COVID, it's mental health overdiagnosis, and it's sick influencers. And there's, I'm sure, a smattering of other issues, like I mentioned, with low trust and things like that. But it's quite a mess. And COVID, I think, is the real thing to blame.
And so we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is all taxpayers' money going on this. And in some cases, these are quite nice cars. And I think there's another aspect, which is that the bosses of Motability themselves seem to be making an enormous amount of money. I mean, there is some profligate spending here, isn't there, Willie?
Yeah, totally. I think the first thing we need to sort of dispel is that, okay, like, people will say it's not taxpayer funded. That's the argument I hear. It is subsidized quite heavily. So, for example, Motability cars enjoy unique tax breaks, whether it's a VAT or insurance premium tax exemptions, which the National Audit Office found in 2018. And this is before the Motability scheme really started to climb up to gargantuan numbers. They were worth about £700 million. And also this means that this subsidy means that top range vehicles like the famous touted electric BMW, which you need a down payment of about £8,000 to get. Top range vehicles are up to like 50% cheaper on the Motability scheme than they are on the private market. Also, each vehicle comes with free road tax, rack breakdown cover, servicing, MOT, tyre and windscreen repair, installation for a charge point for electric cars, for example. That was released with the Daily Express just this weekend, which I commented on. And insurance paid for also multiple drivers, whether it's family, friends, or a carer. And also claimants can apply for a new model every 3 years. So yes, while you do have to exchange your PIP Motability claim in order to put down payments on these cars are still heavily subsidized in a lot of ways because they've got exemptions that an ordinary car wouldn't. If an ordinary taxpayer bought a car, they wouldn't be able to get it 50% cheaper unless it was really, really secondhand. And even then, it would, by the nature of being secondhand, it's not a top of the line car. They don't get free road tax. They have to, pay their servicing and the car sorted MOT. They have to jump through loopholes with their own insurance company to get more than one person put onto the, car. And, most ordinary taxpayers don't buy a new car every 3 years, especially not top of the line ones. Now, I think it is important to state that I think an element of this has been slightly sensationalized due to the electric BMW thing. It is true that not all, and not even the majority of people on the Motability scheme are claiming the electric BMW that's often posted on social media. That's just used as one example. But for example, the TikTok influencer I mentioned earlier did show a car which had a down payment of maybe £300 or £400. Right, and that's still, obviously, it's not a top of the line car, but it's still a car nonetheless. So I think, although you can get nice cars on the Motability scheme, that is a very small percentage of them, and I don't think that it's helpful when discussing this issue to really, really focus on the electric BMW thing, because then you're just being seen as, a bit mean, a bit harsh, and and overgeneralizing and sensationalizing. But one thing that was interesting about the Motability stuff that happened not just over last weekend but this weekend as well, which I weighed into, was the Guardian article which came out just the other day, which basically was saying that why is the right-wing press and right-wing anonymous Twitter accounts going after the Motability scheme. And this guy just straight up argued that it wasn't taxpayer funded, but as I've just told you, it's heavily, heavily subsidized. Second of all, he said that there was zero misuse or fraud in the scheme. And yet this morning in the Financial Times, like the headline was UK Motability to crack down on misuse of motoring schemes for disabled people, with their own CEO admitting that there'd been misuse of the scheme. And apparently, over the last year, the amount of claims they looked into of misuse totaled to over 35,000 people. Right, that's just in the last year. And then last year removed about 5,300 customers from the service, which is about 15 people per day. So the Guardian basically trying to dismiss this as something only interested in right-wing nutcases on Twitter. Like, if their own CEO, if the Motability company itself is coming out and saying there's been misuse of the scheme, I'm actually going to believe the Motability scheme guys, not a Guardian journalist, I'm afraid. I mean, when it comes to, you mentioned earlier about the Motability's CEO, I mean, yeah, they get a nice salary, £460,000 a year their CEO got, and he got a bonus of 198,000. Their CFO earned 374,000 with a bonus of over 114,000. And also, interestingly, is how valuable their car collection is, their fleet car. Motability has the biggest fleet of cars in Europe, and it's estimated to be valued to be around £14 billion. Like, that's not a small amount of money. Also, they're also one of the biggest buyers of EV cars as well. I think about 20. They buy most 20% of their cars are EV, or they buy 20% of their cars to be EVs, which is essentially keeping that EV car element of the economy alive. Really, it's essentially an EV lease scheme at that point. And also, my question would be saying that if you want to make cars as cheap and affordable for people who genuinely are disabled, why are you buying top of the range EV cars, which makes clearly no sense to me, but maybe there's a net zero element there that we're perhaps not discussing. But yeah, I mean, the fact that the guys at Motability admit there'd been misuse, and that, the now shadow DWP secretary Helen Wheatley is putting pressure on the government to do something about it, and as I mentioned earlier, this scheme is on government's lips. I don't think it's useful to the overall discussion for when people talk about the Motability scheme to get so worked up on either one side, because when you have the people who just talk about the electric BMWs, it's like, well, okay, but the majority of the cars aren't electric BMWs, and a lot of them are lowered down. Now, I'm not saying a lot of the people using the lowered down cars should also be getting those cars, but I'm pointing out that you're using like a really, really sensationalized figure. But also, I don't think it's useful for people on the complete opposite side who think there's nothing wrong with the system at all. People are just doing this to attack disabled people, which I think is objectively not true. One of the main concerns I've seen is that this scheme has got out of control to the extent that it's no longer benefiting the people it was supposed to benefit in the first place, and dismissing these people, such as myself and the Taxpayers Alliance and other people, as right-wingers who just want to punish disabled people, when actually the opposite is the complete case. I think there is a clear consensus ground which we can have, which is the Motability scheme was good, but as a lot of the welfare state has grown over the last few years, I mean, we're predicted to be spending almost £100 billion by 2029, 2030 on disability benefits alone. I mean, that's almost as much as we spend on debt interest per year, and that's significantly more than we spend on the military or transport and a variety of other areas of government spending. There's a clear need to have this reformed, because having a benefit bill that large by the end of this decade is not sustainable. And also, considering how fast Motability has grown over the last few years, when are people going to finally admit that actually no, not everybody who has mixed anxiety or depression or ADHD and so forth should be entitled to a car, and because the average British taxpayer is subsidising this very heavily, and a lot of them, like I said, can't afford nice cars or even just second-hand cars. A lot of them have to use public transport, which is also crumbling to its knees. To what extent do we have to recognise that actually British taxpayers are being fleeced, not just for the Motability scheme, but also for a rising benefit bill, which, quite frankly, we can't afford, and we're a complete outlier compared to a lot of other countries, because we haven't bounced back since COVID. More people have not getting to work. I mean, one thing I do applaud Kendall for And one thing I applaud Male Stride for is the drive to get more disabled people back into work. And there's some great private businesses and great schemes actually ran by disabled people themselves who are helping disabled people get back into work, and I fully support them. But any welfare reform needs to recognise that that is the main way in order to reduce the benefit bill, which is getting more disabled people back into work. And there's loads of different options now, not just with disability access to offices and things like that, but hybrid working and remote working and things like that. That is the only way in which the benefit bill is going to be sorted, and one of the only ways this Motability issue is going to be sorted. But yeah, I don't think it's helpful when people are trying to have, an intelligent discussion about welfare reform for, people on the there's nothing wrong with the welfare state side, to dismiss people like myself and other people online as being, and other journalists as well, as being careless and misrepresenting and misinformation and just hating disabled people. And that is the furthest thing from the case.
Yeah, okay, let's zoom out a little bit then. And so, of course, this is in the context of, the highest tax burden since the Second World War, a cost of living crisis. And, of course, you mentioned the fact that the welfare bill is only going to be increasing in coming years. And so the question is, well, what is the Chancellor going to do at her spring statement? Now, we're recording this before that, but the idea is maybe that she'll be trimming some public spending. Do you think she'll go through with that? And I mean, what do you think, what should they be looking to do?
Yeah, I mean, they estimate it's only going to save about £5 billion, which is quite frankly quite a drop in the ocean in regards to the numbers I've just stated to you previously. I think Kendall is authentically in favour of sorting this out. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt. I've never met the Secretary of State. I don't know if all of this is just media bluster from her, but I do, from what I've seen, think she is genuinely concerned about this, because I think when Labour came into power, because there was a sort of certain feeling that amongst the general public that it wasn't politicians who were generally incompetent at running a state and letting taxes rise and debt rise and welfare rise. It's all to do with the Conservatives. And then Labour get in, and then Labour get in and realise, oh, this is quite a mess. And do the Conservatives have a lot of blame for that? Absolutely, yes, they do. They're the reason a lot of the ballooning of the welfare state happened over COVID, for crying out loud. I mean, Sunak and
Labour cheerleaded it.
Yeah, and Labour cheerleaded it as well. So that they both have a lot to blame. Sunak and Boris implemented it, and Starmer and their team cheerleaded it too. But realities hit them, and they've recognised that actually a lot of the things they've wanted to do, they can't do because they don't have any money. Only if they change their fiscal rules, which would then mean they borrow more, which again will just increase the national debt and mean that debt interest spending would just go up and up and up, or they'd have to tax more, which again, Britain's tax burden is already is soaring to a record high, and we're losing more high net worth individuals than we've ever seen before. I think only China beats us in the amount of millionaires we're losing. The Adam Smith Institute does a fantastic millionaire tracker, which your viewers should totally check out to see just how many people we're losing every single year, because our argument is actually, no, we want rich people to come here and stay here and pay tax so that we can afford a national healthcare service, a welfare state, and so on and so forth. But I think they've recognised that it's going to be very difficult, and I think Labour feels naturally uncomfortable doing welfare reform, healthcare reform, public sectors reform more generally, because they're seen as the party as the public sector. If the Tories do it, everyone sort of expects that, don't they? But with Labour do it, but there is an argument I heard recently which I find very interesting. It's the Nixon-China argument. Like, only Nixon could go to China. Maybe only Labour could fix the welfare state or fix the NHS, because at least they're not trying to quote-unquote privatise it, because they've explicitly said they were against doing so. They're not trying to hammer disabled people. Liz Kendall herself has explicitly said, we're not going to be targeting the people at the very, very bottom. We're going to be going after misuse and also focusing our reform on getting people back into work. But she's committed about £1 to £1.5 billion for that to be done. and has said that she'll work with private organisations and charities who are also very interested in getting disabled people back to work. But there's also a flip side to this, which is you can't say you want people to get back into employment, and you can't say that you want to reduce the benefits bill by then slamming businesses with national insurance, which will cause many of them to either not hire new people, fire people they've hired already, refuse to give people pay rises, refuse to expand, and some of them even shut down. You can't, on the one hand, say that you're in favour of reducing unemployment and helping people get back to work by working with people in the private sector, when Labour has explicitly smashed the private sector since they came into office. So the spring statement, that will happening tomorrow, is going to be on this week. Is going to be interesting to see whether Reeves is willing to do any of the things that she's touted to, especially regarding civil service reform and welfare reform, because it is true that the civil service has got out of hand. I mean, the civil service, I think we at the Taxpayers Alliance found that last year, it's almost like over 13%, 13 times bigger than His Majesty's Armed Forces. Like, that's pretty crazy in terms of the amount of civil servants we have. But the reforms need to be radical. They need to be fast. And unfortunately, Whitehall's not known for its radical nature or its fast nature, and whether any of these reforms will be implemented in time or will just be done, we're going to be doing this over the next 4 to 5 years. It's like, that's not really enough time, to be honest with you. It needs to be done as fast as possible.
Yeah, so we're coming up on time, so I'll just give you one thing on that. If you were Rachel Reeves in the spring statement, what is one thing you would do?
One thing I would do, it would be to cut the civil service and cut it as fast as possible. But one thing I think I would do if I was Rachel Reeves is I'd reverse the punitive national insurance hike on employers, and I'd also reverse the family farms tax. Like, you can't on the one hand say that you're in favour of growth and the party of business, like Labour ran on this, they were the new party of business, Tories ignored businesses. And then one of the first things you do is increase the employers' national insurance on not just big businesses, but small businesses who are going to be the most affected, which would cause unemployment, low growth, people not having enough money to hire new employees or invest in other places. They're the two things I would do. I would repeal those things, and inversely, in order to make up the shortfall, because there is a shortfall in the public finances, I understand that, I would completely abolish, I would not just reduce the foreign aid budget like Starmer has done, I would just completely abolish it for the moment, because it's quite clear to me we can't afford to be spending money abroad when we've got so many domestic problems at home that need fixing first. So I know that you don't want a more simple answer, but actually I'd go ahead with the civil service reforms and the welfare reforms, but I would reverse the two taxes which I think are going to do the most damage to growth and put the most people out of work when Reeves and Kendall and Starmer are so desperate to get people back into work and get the economy growing. But you need to do that with businesses, and you can't do that if you tax businesses to the degree that small businesses end up closing.
William Yarwood, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, Laurie.
Now, the new Netflix drama Adolescence, in which a 13-year-old boy stabs his female classmate to death after a social media dispute, has been hailed by the political class as God's gift to television. Supposedly, it shines a light on the real dangers of toxic masculinity and the online manosphere. In what was no doubt a Freudian slip, Keir Starmer even referred to it in the Commons as a documentary, and has said it should be shown in schools. But does this depiction of an ordinary 13-year-old being radicalised by the internet really ring true? And should we be basing social policy on what's really a work of fiction? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined once again on The Sceptic by David Shipley, who's a writer on prisons and justice and many other things. Welcome back to The Sceptic, David.
Hi, Laurie. It's great to be here again.
Good to have you here. Okay, so I understand you haven't actually watched the show, but nevertheless, it's been hard to miss the commentary that there's been on it and the way it's been taken up rapidly as this cause célèbre by our political class. And I suppose, well, what have you made of that eagerness with which it's been treated? Because, it's not a documentary, it's a work of fiction, but it seems to be being treated as if it were portraying something very, very real by our political leaders.
Yeah, I think that's what's fascinating. You're absolutely right. I haven't watched it. As a busy freelance, lots of things, and the father of a toddler, I'm afraid I don't get to watch very much TV. But what I have noticed is the huge reaction to this show. And I think what's fascinating is that people, and by people I mean mostly politicians and commentators, are treating this piece of drama, this piece of fiction, as if it speaks to fundamental truths about our society and therefore defines what policy we should pursue as a country, which is really odd. You know, a couple of years ago we had the drama about the postmasters who had been unjustly prosecuted, and in many cases convicted and jailed for apparent fraud, which was actually nothing of the sort. It was simply a function of a system which wasn't working.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.